Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Transmat committee for giving me this opportunity to be here speaking to you today. I will be speaking today the intersections between colonial memory, university collections, and the politics of representation, focusing on the controversial cabinet of curiosities at the University of Coimbra. In recent years, societies have been reassessing their colonial legacies, leading to heated debates on restitution, decolonization, and historical accountability. Universities, as sites of knowledge production, are central to these discussions. However, they have also been slow to confront their complicity in colonialism. This presentation explores how institutions, particularly Coimbra, continue to reproduce colonial narratives through their collections and exhibitions. To understand contemporary debates about colonization, we need to consider the broad memory games at play in post-colonial societies. Across Europe, colonial legacies are being reassessed, with countries debating their historical roles. Public policies and cultural institutions shape how colonialism is remembered and erased. For example, France attempted to enshrine the so-called positive aspects of colonialism in a law in 2005, sparking protests and revisions. Similarly, in Portugal, the reluctance to fully engage with colonial violence is evident in political discourse and public institutions. The question remains, who controls the narrative of the past and how does that influence the colonial efforts? Universities are key players in this debate as they hold vast collections of colonial-era artifacts, manuscripts, and even human remains. These collections were often acquired to colonial expeditions, scientific racism, and imperial power dynamics. In recent years, pressure has grown for universities to return looted artifacts and rethink their curricula. France has committed to repatriating African artifacts, while institutions like Oxford and Cambridge are under pressure to return such items. Despite this effort, resistance remains strong as universities struggle to reconcile their colonial legacies with demands for restitution. One of the most visible movements for decolonization in universities was Rhodes Must Fall, which began in South Africa in 2015. At the University of Cape Town, students demanded the removal of Cecil Rhodes' statue, arguing that it symbolized the violent legacy of colonialism. The movement quickly spread to the UK and the US, highlighting deeper issues within universities: who they honor, who they include, and what histories they privilege. At Oxford, students campaigned to remove the Rhodes statue at Oriel College, leading to broader discussions on university curriculum and racial representation. The movement showed that colonization is not just about statues, but about fundamentally rethinking how institutions function. We cannot colonize the curriculum without colonizing the institution. This quote from a Rhodes Must Fall activist captured the essence of the debate. The colonization cannot be limited to symbolic gestures. It must involve structural change. Decolonizing the curriculum means moving beyond Eurocentric perspectives and including voices from the global South. However, universities are not neutral spaces. They are embedded in histories of colonial wealth and exclusion. As scholars like Akil Membe argue, institutions must dismantle the colonial frameworks that shape knowledge, production, governance, and access. This raises a key challenge. Are universities willing to go beyond token reforms and truly address the colonial past? Portugal has been slow to engage with its colonial past, but recent statements from political figures reveal shifting tensions in how the country approaches its history. The Republic President acknowledged Portugal's responsibility for colonial crimes, including slavery, and suggested that the country must pay the cost of its past. Meanwhile, former Prime Minister expressed deep regret for the Yaramu massacre, where Portuguese forces killed hundreds of civilians in Mozambique in 1972, though they stopped short of issuing an official state apology. These statements mark a departure from previous political narratives, yet debates remain on whether Portugal should formally apologize or provide reparations. The controversy reflects broader tensions between recognition, denial, and historical accountability in Portugal's approach to its colonial history. These debates are not just political, they also play out in institutional spaces, such as museums and universities. The Cabinet of Curiosities of the University of Coimbra is a prime example. In 2022, the University of Coimbra inaugurated this exhibit, showcasing over 4,000 objects, including ethnographic artifacts, taxidermized animals, and human remains. The display aims to recreate the 17th and 18th century tradition of curiosity cabinets, but it has been criticized for lacking critical contextualization. There are no captions or interpretative texts, leaving visitors without guidance on the provenance or ethical implication of the artifacts. There are essentially two types of objects in the cabinet: animalia, taxidermed specimens, including monstrosities such as a six-legged donkey and a two-headed snake, alongside fossils and minerals, and artificial cultural artifacts, including African masks, amulets, and all scientific instruments. The room is kept dimly lit with spotlights selectively illuminating objects, creating an atmosphere of mystery and discovery. There are no labels or captions provided for the spectators, leaving visitors to explore freely and form their own interpretations. The most problematic aspect of this collection is that human remains are exhibited alongside taxidermized animals with no clear distinction or contextualization, raising ethical concerns about representation and respect for the cultures of origin. Because of these issues, a lot of criticism and controversies have sparked. The absence of historical background and provenance details risks perpetuating the stereotypes and colonial narratives that for centuries have upheld European empires. At the same time, this display of human remains next to taxidermized animals with no clear differentiation has been criticized as dehumanizing and culturally insensitive. The debate on colonizing museums collection has begun with this cabinet, and the need to decolonize museums and to present artifacts with historical accountability has appeared afterwards. So with this exhibition, we can conclude that contemporary societies are increasingly revisiting their colonial past, leading to debates over historical accountability, memory, and restitution. The tensions between recognition, denial, and reform continue to shape discussions on colonial legacies in education, museums, and public discourse. Universities are therefore sites of memory and power. They upheld European empires for centuries, and they created the elite that would govern European colonies. The Rose Must Fall movement illustrated how symbolic colonization status and curricula is inseparable from structural transformation, institutional power, funding, and governance. At the same time, you can conclude that Portugal has an ambivalent position regarding its colonial past. While political figures like the former Prime Minister have acknowledged Portugal's colonial violence, debates remain on apologies, reparations, and responsibility. The Cabinet of Curiosities of the University of Coimbra reveals the persistence of colonial modes of representation and the challenge of ethically engage with imperial collections. Decolonization is not just about the past, but it's just how we think about our social structures today. Whether in education, museums, or politics, societies must decide how they engage with history and whether they will perpetuate colonial narratives or actively dismantle them. The question remains, is acknowledging the past enough, or does true historical accountability require material and institutional change? And here is a list of suggested readings if you are interested in the theme. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear us? Hear me at least? Yeah, good, thank you. Well, it's just because I wasn't expecting us to speak now, so I'm a bit... we'll start with a statement of positionality, because we think it's very important in a context like this one. So as being kindly presented now, so I'm an Egyptian heritage and museum professional. I currently work as a senior curator at the Horniman Museum and Gardens in London. But I think what is most important is also to understand why I always insist on being referred to as an Egyptian heritage specialist, not only because this is my own lived experience, but equally for me as a way to assert my own indigeneity, if I'm allowed to say, because this is something problematic when it comes to North Africa, but within a context of decolonizing, or a context where we are reflecting on the histories of African collections in European museums. Usually someone like me would get invited into projects, or would get invited into being a guest curator or a researcher to collaborate on a project that would have something to do with Egypt in the attempt or in the hope that this would be disruptive, just with the impression that having me on board makes it automatically disruptive, which is not the case. I might be disruptive, yes, but just having someone who's Egyptian or having an indigenous scholar or an indigenous museum specialist on board, first of all, there is usually the impression that whatever I say is a representation of all Egyptian archaeologists. We're 100 million, that's practically impossible. Not a single member of my family share the same idea about anything. And equally having me on board, particularly within a European setting, it means that, I don't know how do you refer to it in Portugal, but we have the equality, diversity, inclusion. So I'm a woman, so that's a tick box. I'm visibly Muslim, another tick box. So I tick all the boxes for the EDI. And that makes it problematic because I always worry of being used as a token in settings like this, that my representation is not sincere, it's just tokenized.
Thank you. So conversely, I've worked in museums for 12 years. So I left in 2022, the Horniman Museum, and I moved to UCL. So I've been thinking a lot, something that I've always been thinking about as a practitioner, but increasingly over the last 5 years, is what's my responsibility as someone with institutional privilege. So that comes from my positionality, obviously, as being an educated white woman who has a particular background, who's been working in this sector for a long time, and also language fluency. So that's language, you know, it's amazing being in a conference here, but recognizing that everybody's being asked to speak in English and how that reinscribes a particular form of power around the exchange of ideas, but also cultural fluency. Museums are really weird places. They have a very particular ideology around, you know, the material perpetuity and the importance of the archive, and these are things that all need to be challenged. But having worked in an institution, there is a particular privilege that comes with understanding that. So one thing that I'm trying to be aware of is a white saviour impulse and its impact. So this is our EDI photo for our project HEBA, and Natalie Cooper, who's an amazing PhD student, someone who I've worked with, who's doing really amazing work, looking critically at the Horniman. Something that I think a lot about is, you know, in this context as somebody with this privilege, there is a real sense of wanting to make things better, being on the right side of history. I'm doing things much better than my forefathers, and there's a certain celebration or a sense of ethical completeness that comes with that, right? But thinking very carefully about how that takes up space, that sense of doing good work, it disables honesty and transparency, and it often means that what needs to be addressed is not. Something that I think is part of that responsibility is weighing up where there's a possibility to disrupt structures of practice, but also when to work within those structures to bring colleagues along, and understanding what those structures are and where the gaps are in order to create change. But also that it's okay not to be in the conversation. You know, a lot of these engagements involve inviting community members in to work with collections, and the curators kind of hovering over with their notebook to take down, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll note that down and I'll put it in the catalogue. Do you have permission to do that? Sometimes it's best just to leave. You know, I think it's a really important recognition, something I've been thinking about. Thank you.
So what we've been working on is the Egypt's Dispersed Heritage Project, because Egypt is quite a very interesting case study, and obviously I have my biases being Egyptian, but when we think of the removal of cultural belongings from a certain indigenous or a source community and having it exported worldwide, Egypt is one of, the scale and scope of dispersal of Egyptian heritage is unmatched with any other cultural belonging that comes from any other culture, not just in Africa, but all over the world. Many of you might have grown up in a city or a town that you would have a small, tiny museum that would still have an ancient Egyptian belonging displayed there. Many of you grew up going to a museum where a visit to an Egyptian gallery was part of your rite of passage to become into adulthood. And this dispersal led to the displacement of not only the ancient Egyptians, but equally of the contemporary Egyptians from their cultural belongings. And this comes one way or the other from what we perceive or who we perceive as indigenous, and the biases that come with who gets to decide what is a community of descent and who are source communities and who are not. And particularly with the case of Egypt is extremely problematic, even within the setting of Africa, because usually in conferences like this one, there would be very little, if any, reference to Egypt, because Egypt is usually perceived as the Orient. It's quite exotic, it's a fetish, it's a concept, it's not really a country, it's not a living culture. And we've been working together with the Horniman and a variety of 5 other museums in the UK in trying to create ways where we could use these collections as spaces for Egyptian resistance, where we would invite Egyptian comic artists, Egyptian researchers, Egyptian activists to look at the collections that exist at the UK and create responses that are not necessarily responses to help the museum bring change, but it's actually to help us having a voice, or to center our voices in discussions of decolonizations, or in even how Egypt is represented or seen in UK Western museums. The problem that comes, and why particularly Egypt, as I said, is that there is equally, when we reflect on decolonization, and there is something that has just happened even yesterday, where there is the African group in the UK, they've released a statement and a report on human remains, and obviously because of how, I do hate to use the word mummies, but I use it for simplicity now, that having mummies in any press release, it means that this is something that will grab wider attention all over the world. It's a buzzword that would attract a lot of public attention. And the report came out, and interestingly, there was no consultation whatsoever with the Egyptian communities. And this is not just the case with this report, but this is the usual case, because Egypt is perceived as uncontested, unclaimed. It is orphaned in the sense that it has no modern or contemporary, this is the perception that the West has created and the Orientalist image that came with the colonial extraction of Egypt, but equally the colonial disenfranchisement of the contemporary communities at the time. We are seen as Arab settler communities, despite of how we do not self-identify as such, and even historical and archaeological evidence goes against such perceptions. But this brings us to reflect on how, even when we claim that we're doing decolonizing, it's extremely problematic, because it's very much centered on collections. There is very little reference to what these colonial legacies have done to contemporary communities like myself, in the sense of us not being perceived as source community or community of descent whatsoever. It's very Western-centered. Conversations still happen widely within a Western context. It's very much also centered on museum, as if this is something, repatriation or decolonization is something that is being done to bring good to a museum setting rather than to repair or to bring some social justice and inclusion to the communities who have long been harmed. It's equally quite selective, because even in the very famous Savoy-Sarr report, Egypt was not included as part of the African collections that needs to be repatriated. Egypt is never part of these discussions whatsoever, so it makes us reflect on equally the injustice that comes with the current decolonizing turn.
So in the second half of this, HEBA and I are going to reflect on some of the structural tensions that we faced working together on a project called All Eyes on Her. And this project came about because the Horniman not only has a collection of Egyptian archaeology, but also a more contemporary collection of women's clothing from the 1980s. We don't know who collected it, and HEBA can tell us about the sense that it's probably collected by a white researcher who's working in Cairo, who's working within a particular framework of what women might wear and what is representative. So we had this collection, and we started thinking about how we could work together to foreground a different perspective and a different narrative that's centering Egyptian women.
So what we've done is that we felt that given the focus of the collection is actually women, and interestingly also the focus of the archaeological Egyptian collection that exists at the Horniman is also very much women-centered and female-centered, and we felt that part of the erasure that happened either by Western archaeology, but equally by the auto-colonial turn that Egypt has taken after even independence, that we might want to center the narratives of women. We want to center the stories of women and also use the collection, be it the archaeological collection and the contemporary collection, again as a space of resistance where we can bring the everyday activism that Egyptian women have been doing either in the past or in the present to change how Egypt is represented in a museum or to change how Egypt is displayed. It's just, this is a sneak peek. This is something that is from the studios, because the exhibition, it's a tiny display. We call it an intervention because it's a wider project than this. But this is in progress, so you're very, well, I don't mean it in a bad way, but you're very privileged to be able to see this because this is not out in the public yet, but just for you to see that we've collaborated with Egyptian graphic artists, Egyptian women from all walks of life, to have a reflection on both the archaeological collection, but equally the contemporary collection, and we've equally had new acquisitions. And part of the approach that we've used and something that we've wanted is that we don't really call it a research project, so we don't see All Eyes on Her as a research project, neither us, both of us, or even we're trying to convince the museum not to see it this way. We call it, it's part of our duty of care towards the communities from whom these collections have been taken and whose voices have been erased and silenced throughout history. And we came up with this approach from our previous projects, the Egypt Dispersed Heritage Project that I was saying that we were working with comic artists, etc. And we came up with this way of trying to find a path to empathy where we work in a where we center empathy in everything that is being done in a museum practice, because museums are also violent spaces, not only in the respect of how things were taken, but equally in the organizational structure of them, because they are created in a way to retain a certain power structure that usually marginalized communities, even within from the actual community that lives around the museum, would find it really tricky to take part in decision-making authorities within the museum. So we came up with a way that we can not only disrupt the organizational structure of the museum, but equally the way funding operates and the way ethics reviews operates within a university and a museum setting, because the funding that we've got mostly came from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and that's a university setting. So we came up with how we need a relational accountability, because usually within settings like this, we're only accountable to the museum, we're only accountable to the funding body when it comes to the type of outputs, the deadlines, etc. We created a way where this is relational. We are equally, us and the museum, the funding body and the university is equally accountable to the communities themselves, not only that they have to meet the deadlines, but also the funding body needs to have, to make sure that communities are paid on time, communities are paid fairly and with justice. We tried as much as we can to follow community ethics, not just the ethics that is prescribed by the university. We had an approach of sensitive transparency, because something we were discussing, that this concept of radical transparency is usually very Western, because not only of how these collections are very problematic and sensitive and traumatizing for the communities from which they were extracted, but equally there are cultural and religious sensitivities that exist within various communities that makes radical transparency doing actually something that comes with negative impact. The main foundation was the right to refuse, that communities had the right to refuse to collaborate with us at any certain point within the project, and that right to refuse did not affect the rights of being paid or the rights of being credited where they found appropriate.
Thank you. So HEBA and I have a podcast series called Only Collections in the Building, which is really trying to engage with how structures of practice in museums foreground collections and the priorities around risk, around material perpetuity and care over people. And we have 5, and we're going to talk about 2 of them today. The first is Unpinning Colonialism, which is giving a bit of a broad outline of our project, in particular looking around a packet of pins and how our collaboration, HEBA's involvement, was essential to understanding what this object was, this cultural belonging. The second we're going to talk about is I Don't Accept Horniman's Grift, which is about how ideas of generosity and doing good work become infiltrated into museum spaces and obstruct the possibility for real change. The third is on money. I think money is something we don't talk about enough, but it's absolutely foundational to the way that power is reinscribed in museum institutions, not just having enough of it, but also how it's distributed and how it is translated, for example, through the contract. And just the right to refuse is a really good big example of how to challenge that. Mistranslations is looking at how power is inscribed through language and attempts to disrupt that and some of the difficulties that we faced at an institutional level. And lastly, we're thinking about solidarity and risk, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today. So the first we're going to talk about is I Don't Accept Horniman's Gift. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So in my role as senior curator, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to be transparent about process. So HEBA and I were collaborating, and I felt, okay, we need to collaborate at every level. So we were creating an interpretation plan in the museum, which was about the exhibition, setting out some of the key messages. And every interpretation plan at the Horniman begins with the museum's values. So I started working with this, and I sent it to HEBA. She immediately emailed back, and she said, I can't accept this, and HEBA will tell you why.
Part of the aims of the Horniman and how the Horniman sees themselves is how they cherish Frederick Horniman, and Frederick Horniman is Johanna would have to say more about him. I know some things, but I don't really like to talk about him that much because I don't think he should be centered in any conversation, but it is because of his gift to create this museum, because he was a tea merchant, he was a very rich Victorian British who apparently had some liberal ideas anyway, but it usually has to come that this is foregrounded in how the museum and its staff, they see themselves, that they cherish Horniman's founding gift and safeguarding and developing it for future generations and embedding a spirit of guidance, kindness and generosity. Interestingly, the way that Horniman have collected some of the cultural belongings from Egypt is quite dubious. Some of them were collected illegally and illicitly. And to be fair, I don't see any kindness in the way he collected any of this material. Neither is it generous, because in my culture, you need to own something to give it to someone else to be called generous. This is generosity in my understanding. I can't steal something from Johanna and then offer it to you and tell you, oh, see how generous I am. And that's for me, that's how I read it. This is generosity in offering something that you don't own to others. That is not generosity, this is theft. And I have also to be very open about something here, that I felt reflecting on it years later now, that at the time I did have a research fellow post at UCL, which means that I did have the security of having a source of money, a source of income. Because this is usually something that we don't reflect on more. Many researchers like myself, before getting a post, or if they ever are lucky enough to get a post because of the difficulties with immigration laws and work placements, etc., that means that most of them work freelance. And that also comes with insecurity. I felt that I could speak up, not only because I had this trust and relationship with Johanna, but also I had the financial security in the sense that if this project didn't go on and I was not allowed to continue, then I do have a source of income to continue. So it's also important to reflect that there is also sometimes that when there are things that are unsaid, not because that everything going is appropriate, but there is so much risk that the person could be also taking, that could be in terms of finances too.
So we took that passage out. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit, just very briefly, about Horniman. There is this Horniman cult, so if you speak to anybody in London, they'll say, oh, I love the Horniman, and it has this reputation of doing good work, of historically doing good work. That's both to do with the foundation of Frederick Horniman, so HEBA said he had some liberal ideas. He was an MP for the Liberal Party and he was an abolitionist. But at the same time, he accrued his wealth on the tea trade, which was an exploitative trade that relied fundamentally on the flooding of the Chinese market with opium in order to reduce the price of tea. So that is how he made his wealth. So as HEBA has said, his generosity was very much built on the exploitation of other people. There's this idea that he was a good colonial. He was different. You know, he wasn't Robert Mulligan. He wasn't a slave owner. He wasn't a kind of a military official. But actually, I think when we think about colonial history, it's actually thinking about the good people, the liberal people, is the way into understanding the difficulties that we have in addressing that history. It's easier and more straightforward to address a military incursion than it is in the way that the Victorian welfare system fundamentally is underpinned by ideas of race and oppression. So something we're thinking of as a result of this relationship with Frederick Horniman is a historical lesson how the moral capital that comes from doing something can divert attention away from when you're doing nothing. And I think that is foundational to all institutions. You know, it's okay, you know, I am anti-racist because I am doing this piece of work, but there's all this other work that I can't do because I don't have capacity and I don't have money. So the suggestion is focus on where you're doing nothing and use that as the impetus for where to go next. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about is risk. I hope we have a few more minutes. It's just a few more slides. Thinking carefully about how ideas of risk and solidarity create a particular kind of tension in a museum context. And
So with the events with the genocide in October 7 onwards, what happened is that we've been contacted by the museum at the time, reflecting on what risks would come to the museum now that we're having All Eyes on Her as a project coming out, and if there is something that the museum should be aware of in reference to responses from anti-genocide or Palestinian activists to the exhibition itself. That was back in October 7. And the response that we had is that what we need to reflect on is not the damage that is happening, that the damage that the museum might face of having All Eyes on Her or a project that celebrates Egyptian women as a way to reflect on how North African and Middle Eastern women in general are perceived, and that comes with a certain sense of, at the time, there was a little bit, at least in the UK, of the political scene was quite imbued, and institutions were in this, I don't know, something I can never understand, because where the right side of history was very clear, at least to me, but it seems that it wasn't clear to everyone else. What happened at the time that we responded saying, or I responded saying, that one needs to reflect that the risk is not, it doesn't stand with how, within the museum, that it's not the museum who should be scared of the risk it comes to it, but the risk comes with the communities that we're working with, particularly if this is a cause or a case, regardless of what I believe in it, that they believe strongly on. And they are working with a Western institution that is affiliated to a Western government that has a sentiment that goes against what the majority of the population, including the Egyptian government, reflects. This is where the risk is where breaking the trust and the relationship with the communities. Later on, there was the encampments all over the UK, in UK universities, and there were another genocide in Rafah where thousands of civilians were bombed and dead. And All Eyes On became a slogan. Our project started in 2021, and All Eyes on Her, it's a direct translation of an Egyptian Arabic saying that reflects the experience of women walking in public, that usually all eyes are on you in public spaces. كل العيون عليها. All Eyes On, it's also an idiom that is said in English that you refer to anything. So obviously when the genocide happened and the encampment, that slogan was all over the UK, All Eyes on Gaza, All Eyes on Rafah. It was equally on social media. And when I joined the museum as a curator, I think at the time the relationship between me and the museum has shifted, because now I'm part of the system, I'm part of the institution, so I have more responsibilities towards the museum than what I had before. So one of the first meetings that I've had as a member of staff at the museum was a request to change the title of the project because of the sensitivities that comes with it. And my response was absolutely not, because if the museum refused to make a statement of solidarity, and we will discuss later whether a statement is something that we should do or not, but changing the title after working with communities for nearly 3-4 years is taking a side. Changing the title at the time when All Eyes on Her becomes something related to Palestine, and the museum thinks that no, we need to change that title. If the museums claim that they are being neutral, changing the title at that moment was not being neutral. That meant that they are taking a side. And with the back of the community and how the members of the community, everyone refused to have the title change, then we didn't change the title, and we are retaining the title as such.
So the point we're trying to make is that where there is confidence to stand in solidarity, is very much determined by risk. So one way of thinking about this is in June 2020, where museums across the UK felt very confident in speaking openly about race. So I documented every single museum in the UK and their statement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, which was an incredibly important movement. But what's interesting with that moment is there was greater risk in not standing in solidarity than there was in standing in solidarity. So sometimes when we think about decolonization, we imagine that it's some kind of ethic, it's some kind of position that is strong, that is whole, that sits on solid foundations. But actually it's fundamentally determined around risk and where risk sits. So we just wanted to make that point.
So just reflecting that, as I said, that usually maybe, if that's okay. Yeah. So what happens is that the risk comes with, as we said, that the communities had the right to refuse. So when October 7 happened and when the museum refused, then the stand of the Western government meant that some members of the community felt that they refused to work with the museum, and they had the right to. But the museum didn't reflect on how their lack of solidarity at the time meant that they are breaking relationships and breaking trust with communities at the time. And that breaking of trust it's irreparable damage. That's damage that you cannot repair again. That was something that we felt we needed to flag up, and we respected. This is Moira Ali, one of the comic artists we were going to feature a beautiful graphic novel that she's written about her experience as an Egyptian woman seeking a master's degree in France, and how the Orientalist view that she was seen in. We respected her contribution, and she refused to be affiliated to the project altogether, not to have her mentioned at any point in time. I do have her permission to represent her here in this slide, but only as an act of refusal. Something that we felt that could be done, that came also within the community, that one way for us to resist the lack of solidarity with certain political statements that we felt are important for us, is how we're going to liberate the Egyptian collection that exists at the museum by just changing all the terminologies that exist within the collection. All of the terminologies that come with the Egyptian archaeological material or contemporary material is Orientalist, Eurocentric terminology. So we've organized a community translation sessions where we had the communities literally liberating every single item that we're representing in the museum, in the exhibit, into an Egyptian Arabic word. And that was our way to liberate both ourselves, that we assert our position, that this is an act of resistance. We are here, we are calling our belongings the way we call them back in our country. But it also, we felt that at this stage that maybe some would choose to refuse to collaborate, and that's their act of activism, which is acceptable and it's also appropriate. But others would refer to their act of resistance as taking part, but liberating or bringing more resistance, but actually from within.
Good morning, bom dia. It is a pleasure to be here today, even if only virtually. Thank you to Pedro, Eva, and Johanna for their insightful presentations. First and foremost, I would like to sincerely thank the conference organizers for the invitation to participate and for providing the Trafficants project with the opportunity to be represented. I regret not being able to attend in person, but I truly appreciate the chance to present remotely. I would also like to extend my gratitude on behalf of the project's coordinator, Alberto Lopez, and our colleagues. Okay, in this presentation, I will provide a general overview of the project. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into depth on the ethical, methodological, and theoretical debates that have emerged over the past 2 years. However, my team and I would be happy to share more details on any specific aspects of interest. The Trafficants project was launched in 2023 to investigate the provenance and acquisition conditions of objects and collections from the Spanish colonial empire. The study has primarily focused on collections from Equatorial Guinea, Morocco, and the Philippines, while also considering, to a lesser extent, objects and collections from Nigeria and Senegal. Although these countries were not former Spanish colonies, they maintain strong post-colonial ties to Catalonia. This is one of the first initiatives in Spain and Catalonia to reassess museum collections of colonial origin through the lens of provenance studies. The project was developed within the research group on exclusion and social control and the Solidarity Foundation, both affiliated with the University of Barcelona. It is funded by the government of Catalonia through the Catalan Agency for Development Cooperation with a 3 years duration from 2023 to 2025. Despite the challenges and contradictions inherent in a project of this nature, we believe it offers a valuable opportunity to better understand the colonial collections currently held in Catalonia. It also sheds light on the material and symbolic appropriation processes that have shaped the history of Catalan museums, as well as Catalonia's role in the exploitation and domination of Spain's former colonies. This historical connection continues to be denied by a significant portion of Catalan and Spanish society. However, in recent years, social and political pressure has pushed Catalan museums to reconsider their role and relationship with the colonial past. The project team consists of a diverse group of anthropologists, historians, and social science professionals who have conducted research and initiatives on colonial memory, particularly in Catalonia, Equatorial Guinea, Senegal, and Morocco. This is one of the key reasons why the project places a strong emphasis on African collections. The researchers involved in traffickants have spent decades studying various aspects of colonial legacies in Catalan archives and museums. In recent years, some team members have participated in projects aimed at reinterpreting museum collections at the Ethnological and World Cultures Museum of Barcelona. One such example is the 2017 exhibition and catalogue IN2PAST, Barcelona, Colonial Metropole, which explored the complex and ambiguous ties between Barcelona and Equatorial Guinea through the history of the IN2PAST Center. IN2PAST was an animal acclimatization and conservation center which depended on Barcelona City Council. Other initiatives that examine Barcelona's connections with former Spanish colonial territories includes the exhibition IFNI, Catalans in Military Service in Africa, and the recent report on the Ethnological Museum of Barcelona's collection related to Morocco, titled Between Souks and Boarding Schools, Itineraries and Methods in the Expedition of the Ethnological and Colonial Museum of Barcelona to the Spanish Protectorate in Morocco, among others. The project examines the collections of 7 institutions within Catalonia's public museum network, as well as a collection housed at the University of Barcelona, with the aim of laying the groundwork for their reformulation and reinterpretation. These institutions are the Ethnological and World Cultures Museum, the Museum of Natural Science of Barcelona, the Sabatepi collection at University of Barcelona, the Leader Museum of Igualada and the Anoia region, the Darder Museum of Banyoles, the Víctor Balaguer Library Museum in Vilanova i la Geltrú, and the Leather Art Museum of Vic. Until now, efforts to reassess these collections have often been sporadic, either initiated by the museums themselves or prompted by external actors questioning their practices. In contrast, this project takes a more comprehensive approach, examining colonial collections across multiple institutions with the goal of developing methodologies, intervention strategies, and knowledge transfer frameworks that can be applied across all participating museums. I will now introduce each of these institutions in more detail. The first institution I will introduce is the Ethnological and World Cultures Museum, which is probably one of the most significant museums in this project, as it holds some of the most important colonial era collections in Catalonia. It currently operates in 2 locations. One is the Ethnological Museum in Montjuïc, which focuses on preserving collections and showcasing objects from Catalan communities. The other is the Museum of World Cultures, which opened in 2015 in the Elborn neighborhood and is dedicated to exhibiting so-called non-Western art. The museum was originally founded in Montjuïc in 1949 as the Ethnological and Colonial Museum, explicitly serving as a tool to legitimize Spain's colonial project under the Franco regime. Its collections were assembled through various expeditions conducted between the second half of the 19th century and the mid-20th century in the Philippines, Equatorial Guinea, Ecuador, and Peru. Until 1980s, the museum was directed by August Pañella, who played a key role in acquiring collections through numerous ethnological expeditions. His work was facilitated by collaborations with several figures who were instrumental in shaping the institution, like Jordi Sabater-Pi, a primatologist and ethnologist best known for acquiring and bringing the famous albino gorilla Snowflake to the Barcelona Zoo in 1966, played a crucial role in assembling the museum's fund collections. Also, Albert Folk i Rossinyol, an entrepreneur and collector of one of the largest non-European art collections in Catalonia, contributed as an expert and patron, supporting some of the museum's expeditions. Over the decades, the museum has undergone various transformations, which I will not go into here for the most recent occurred in 2015 with the opening of the Museum of World Cultures. This new space displays a total of 530 objects from the museum's non-European collections, most of which are on loan from private collectors. Notably, a significant portion comes from the Folk Foundation, linked to Albert Folk. The strong aesthetic focus on this new institution, inspired by museums such as the Quai Branly in Paris, was heavily criticized for its ethnocentric approach. This controversy led the museum to organize its first exhibitions addressing Catalonia's colonial past in Africa, like Ikunde and IFNI, both of which are direct predecessors of this project, Traficants. Within this museum, the project has focused on collections from Morocco, Equatorial Guinea, and the Philippines. These three collections contain approximately 4,000 objects acquired through expeditions between 1948 and 1969, and through donations from various institutions and individuals. Among these, the Equatorial Guinean collection has presented the greatest challenges due to the sheer number of objects and the diversity of their origins. I can't explain so much for the time. Most of the Moroccan artifacts in the museum come from 5 expeditions. 3 were carried out during the Spanish Protectorate in Morocco in Protectorate in Morocco in 1952, 1953, and 1956, and 2 additional expeditions took place in 1967 and 1969. In this case, most acquisitions were made in Moroccan souks through a trusted network of traders who worked closely with August Pañella, the former director of the museum. Lastly, the Philippines collections at the Ethnological Museum of Barcelona. The Traficants project has focused on one specific group, a set of 492 colonial era objects donated by the government in 1948, coinciding with the museum's creation. Of these, approximately 400 objects came from a deposit made by José Coronado Ladrón de Guevara, the political military commander of 2 colonial provinces in the Cordillera region of northern Luzon. The diversity of these collections has allowed for an in-depth examination of the contrasting acquisitions methods shaped by the specific context and the varying relationships between collectors and colonial structures in different territories. Secondly, we have the Natural Science Museum, which was formed in 2000 through the unification of the Zoology and Geology Museum, and later expanded with the integration of the Botanical Garden in 2008. Over time, the museum's collections have grown through contributions from naturalists, collectors, hunters, gatherers, and various institutions. Thirdly, we have the Sabatepi collection, housed in the library of the Faculty of Fine Arts at the University of Barcelona. This collection was donated by Jordi Sabatepi, a renowned primatologist and a key collaborator of the Ethnological Museum of Barcelona. His intellectual career was deeply intertwined with Spanish Guinea during the colonial period. Sabatepi became a central figure in the relationship between the colonial territory and the museographic and scientific institutions of Francoist Spain, including the Ethnological Museum, the Institution of African Studies of the CSIC, and the Barcelona Zoo. Many of the initiatives to collect ethnographic objects, animals, or animal remains in late colonial Guinea were either directly controlled by him or carried out with his involvement. The significance of this collection lies in its comprehensive representation of the various activities Sabatepi conducted in colonial Guinea. Fourth, the Museum of Leather of Igualada and the Anoya region. The museum, inaugurated in 1949, opened a dedicated leather section in 1954 with the support of local tanners. It is currently housed in a former textile factory and features collections of objects, tools, and machinery related to the tanning industry. It is related also to Jordi Sabater Pi. Fifth, the Darder Museum of Banyoles, located in the province of Girona in northeastern Catalonia, was founded in 1916 with the collections of Francesc Darder i Llimona, primarily a natural history museum. It houses objects acquired by Darder during his travels across Europe. It is particularly known for having displayed the infamous Negro of Banyoles, which was returned to Botswana in 2000 thanks to the efforts of Alphonse Arthelin, although its precise origin remains unconfirmed. Research on this museum has been challenging to the scarcity or non-existent documentation regarding many of its objects. And given this lack of data, the study has focused primarily on Darder's collection practices. Sixth, we have the Victor Balaguer Library Museum. It was inaugurated in 1884 in Vilanova i la Geltrú. It was promoted by Victor Balaguer, Minister of Overseas Affairs between 1871 and 1872. The museum emerged within the broader context of city modernization projects tied to colonial trade and the trafficking of enslaved people. Among its collection, the Filipino collection stands out as one of the most significant in Spain. Lastly, the Museum of Leather Art in Vic was inaugurated in 1996 in the former convent of Carmen, an 18th century building restored and donated to the Generalitat by businessman and patron Andreu Colomer i Montmany. One key aspect of research on the museum is the figure of Colomer himself and the decontextualization of the objects in the collection. It is suggested that some pieces acquired by Colomer could be linked to his business dealings in different countries, such as Nigeria. Our project is structured around three main lines of action, the first of which is provenance research. As a result of this process, 250 provenance records have been created, a selection of which will be presented on the Trafficant's website, translated into multiple languages. Throughout this phase, members of the research team traveled to Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, France, and Italy to map key restitution and reparative initiatives within the museum sector. These experiences formed the foundation for designing a best practices manual tailored to the Catalan context. Simultaneously, trips were undertaken to Equatorial Guinea, Morocco, and the Philippines to present the research and share preliminary findings, gather recommendations, and establish collaborations with institutions and cultural organizations connected to heritage, which may be interested in partnering with the project. The second line. The Trafficants team lacks representation from community members, reflecting a predominantly white academic framework that perpetuates neocolonial structures. This is evident in the absence of racialized researchers in academic projects among teaching and administrative staff, and even within classrooms. In response to this lack of representation, the project proposed some strategies to mitigate this imbalance and the epistemological biases it creates, while also fostering joint decision-making. At the same time, these strategies aim to gather perceptions, narratives, and expectations regarding the collections and the museum involved, with a view toward potential processes of reinterpretation or restitution. With this premise, two collaboration proposals were developed. The first involves organizing photo elicitation workshops. This consisted of 6 sessions in which groups of 4 to 5 participants were invited to discuss a selection of images related to the analyzed artifact and photographic collections. These sessions were held in Barcelona, Vilanova i la Geltrú, Equatorial Guinea, and the Philippines. The second proposal was the creation of an observation, action, and monitoring group called GOAS, composed of 5 experts linked to the heritage field and the anti-racist movement within the Spanish and Catalan diasporas. This group, whose decisions are binding, is responsible for reviewing, evaluating, and making determinations regarding the planning of research and dissemination activities carried out by the team. The aim is to critically assess the epistemic biases that the study may inevitably reflect and to provide recommendations based on their specialized knowledge in the colonial thought.
Sarah,
This is intended to make participation more structural in nature,
Sarah,
although we are aware of the
you-
great
can-
limitation that this still entails. The third line of action focuses on disseminating the project's results through various formats: a traveling exhibition, a project website, the documentary file 71, which explores the collection of the former governor of Spanish Guinea, and its curatorial treatment of the Ethnological Museum of Barcelona. Finally, a public program of activities. Over the past 2 years, the project has encountered a series of dilemmas and challenges, prompting extensive debates and reconfiguration of its objectives and approaches. To conclude, some of the most significant include the appropriate treatment of sensitive elements within the collections, requiring deep reflection on their historical and cultural context, the need to avoid perpetuating colonial categories that remain embedded in the structure and functioning of institutions. Another major challenge is the risk of instrumentalizing the concept of decolonization and communities for institutional purposes, whether by museums or universities. This danger could lead to the reproduction of epistemic injustices within projects that, in theory, aim to challenge and transform these very structures. These are complex contradictions that we cannot ignore, but we must confront them responsibly. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. Apologies for the technical issues. I thought I would get away with presenting today, but here am I. I'm going to try by all means to be quick as possible so that at least we can have a break. Okay, so I'm based at Queen's College of the City of University of New York. Originally, I'm trained as an archaeologist, but I'm working among anthropologists. This work that I'm going to share with you today, it's a new list that is emerged from the broader research that I'm doing, where I found some solace in dealing with legacy collections. As archaeologists, we are so into digging places, doing excavations, and sometimes we want to run away from legacy collections, staying or stored in museum storage places. But now we are realizing that there is more value in working with existing collections. So that I will share with you. It's research in its infancy. The idea is we want to rebuild from what we have at the moment in terms of like the broader issues that we have, which I'll share with you, and also future prospects regarding what we can do with those collections in terms of like academic research and also public education, especially in terms of the museum institution. All right. So this is my entry point. I am an archaeologist who is working in Africa largely, and this largely kind of guides my work. So we are trying to reimagine African history, African prehistory, but it's on the basis of how Africa is represented. So if you check scholars like Valentine Mudimbe, he talks about the invention of Africa. Africa is a misunderstood continent even up to date. But the idea of Africa, it's connected to the history of slavery, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. It's also connected to the Berlin Conference, which created the modern boundaries that we have that define the different nations that we have in Africa. And all that kind of created what we largely know today as Africa. In the 60s, this is the representation of Africa, even by prominent history professors like Trevor Roper at the University of Oxford. So he's saying perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at the present there is none. Only the history of Europeans in Africa, the rest is darkness. So the idea of Africa as an empty landscape, which was ready for Europeans to occupy, the idea of Africa as a dark continent with no any technology to boast of, no inventions, no architecture, which is breathtaking. In this context, places like Egypt, they were regarded as not part of Africa. So even places like Great Zimbabwe, so one of the sites that we'll be talking about today, they were not part of Africa simply because that geniusness revealed within these structures, you can't imagine it in the context of Africans. So at the end of the day, the way in which Africa was imagined, it was the good aspects of it, the technological innovations, the breathtaking architecture, they were taken away. So urgency was taken away right from the beginning. So that's African history. Timeless Africa. These guys, they don't change. Their culture is static. And no history, like Trevor Rover would push in his arguments. There's no claim, so it's a free territory for all. And there's no civilization, right? But of course, archaeologists have played a pivotal role working with historians, cultural anthropologists, and many other allied disciplinarians to challenge these perspectives to the extent that at least now we have an understanding of what Africa is, but still we have a long way to go. But anyway, currently I think Africa is still a misunderstood concept. So if you check on this map, I just try to probably portray some of the misconceptions of Africa. Some think it's all about Nelson Mandela. Some think it's about Sudan, and they think Sudan is actually in the central part. Then others think about tigers, and lions, right? And, pyramids, at least, they are almost there, in terms of geographical situation, but this is basically the idea. So the moral of the story is that Africa is still a misunderstood continent, even up to date, simply because of the legacy of colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, and it is the role of people like me and you to try to reimagine the history so that at least we create narratives that are connected to the victories, to the inventions, to the science, to the technologies, and so forth that are coming from Africa. So that's my job as an archaeologist, and that's what I've been trying to do. We are trying to reimagine Africa. This map at least does a good job in trying to portray some of the gaps that we have. I teach African archaeology, and I teach, in the US, and I've been teaching African archaeology in South Africa. My experience is that rarely people they know about Africa, especially when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. Egypt, well known. But sub-Saharan Africa, maybe West Africa, they can pick one or two examples, especially maybe the renowned Berlin bronzes, like the Benin Kingdom and so forth. But when you go further south, it's like nothing much is known. So all these gaps, we are trying to fill them, by the research that we are doing, so as to reconstruct the histories that are associated with these civilizations, because there's so much. So if you check most of the textbooks that we use, they portray some of these civilizations in this context whereby there are so many gaps. It seems as if it's kind of an empty landscape, especially when you think about Central Africa, when you think about Southern Africa. The story of Southern Africa is even interesting, when you read topical world prehistory textbooks, like the likes of, that have been written by the likes of Fagan Bryan, and all these are renowned professors of history and archaeology. It's about Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe, Kami, and that's it. Maybe later you can talk about the Zulu, and that's it. So in other words, there are no other civilizations that are sprouting from territories like Angola, from Zambia, and so forth, of which this is our role. We are trying to rebuild or reconstruct those histories. But at the same time, we are doing it in a way that it connects to these local communities, especially in terms of like reclaiming their agency, which they lost, as a result of colonialism and many, many other things. So that's my work I do. So largely I focus in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Southern Africa. I focus on the last 2,000 years, which is largely known as the Iron Age period. All over the world, we have a 3-age system. We have the Stone Age, we have the Bronze Age, then we have the Iron Age. Unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, we can't really talk about the Bronze Age, like in Eurasia or in the Americas, we are skipping from the Stone Age into the Iron Age, and the Iron Age is the last 2,000 years. And because we are so fixated in creating these binaries and also age systems, in Southern Africa we have the early Iron Age, the middle Iron Age, and the later Iron Age, but basically it's the last 2,000 years. And probably if I put in the term Bantu, it can make sense, it can connect with you maybe. I'm largely dealing with descendant communities of the Bantu. So the idea is that they are migrating from a single source in the grassfields area at the border of modern-day Cameroon and DRC, and they are migrating to Southern Africa around 200 AD. Then they develop into these major civilizations, including Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, and Kami. So the story of Southern Africa, when it comes to ancient civilizations, is largely known within the context of this, especially the time between 200 AD up to 1800 AD. That's how far we can talk about civilizations. And guess what? These are largely within the territory of modern-day Zimbabwe and South Africa. So Mozambique, we don't know much what is happening there. But remember, Mozambique has so much to contribute, especially to these civilizations. And also things are happening on the coast there, which we rarely talk about. Right. For those who don't know Mapungubwe, this is Mapungubwe. It's situated also at the border of modern-day South Africa and Zimbabwe, in the Limpopo province. Is largely celebrated globally as the earliest city-state to have emerged in Southern Africa. So when you talk about the history of early states, we can talk about Mapungubwe. It has those characteristics that makes it to be identified as the earliest state. So for instance, inequality. Remember, our modern world today, we have the have-nots and the haves, the rich and the poor. That kind of inequality can be traced to Mapungubwe. These guys, they are genius. They are working on different metals, working on gold, and these are some of the objects that have been recovered from Mapungubwe. They are also connected to distant parts of the world via the Indian Ocean networks, and they are trading in. For instance, we know that glass beads were not actually locally produced. They are coming as far as India. So these guys have connections. But of course, these guys were very genius in the context that they would actually use these glass beads and remelt them to make their own, which is also fascinating about these guys. In terms of architecture, what we see at Great Zimbabwe, which I'm just going to show you, the roots of building stone walls and this magnificent architecture, it's actually rooted at Mapungubwe. So that's Mapungubwe for you, for those who don't know. I guess Great Zimbabwe, we might know it because at least it's popular. Celebrated as the largest pre-colonial structure, sub-Saharan of Africa. So in other words, it is the second largest built structure south of the Egyptian pyramids. So it comes second after the Egyptian pyramids. And we are talking about building walls without mortar, right? Archaeologists think that 18,000 people could have stayed on site at the capital. And Great Zimbabwe is believed to have emerged after the demise of Mapungubwe, around 1290, so it's sprouting from 1300, then it goes as far as 1450. But of course, we are now changing that. We are realizing that there was continuity of settlement, but that's not the story for today. The story of Great Zimbabwe is that there were geniuses in terms of building architecture, making different utilitarian tools, working on different metals, iron, gold, copper. They are even alloying tin and copper to make bronze. Right. We have worked at Great Zimbabwe. We are still working at Great Zimbabwe. Then we have Kami. Oh, sorry, I was afraid. Of course, we have found also these objects at Great Zimbabwe, and we know that some are not locally produced. Like, for instance, that jade teapot is coming from China, right? And archaeologists have recovered that, right? And also even that porcelain, the blue and white, it's also coming from China. So we know that it's connectivity, globalization. In as much as, we don't talk about globalization in the context of African prehistory, but these guys were connected. So bricks is not a new thing. These guys are already doing it. Okay, that's Kami. Kami is thought to have evolved after the demise of Great Zimbabwe. So they are still building those stone monuments, but of course in a different way. They are building on terraces. These are not the only ones. So we have Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, and Kami, but there are many of these. So the earliest generation of Europeans, right from the 1500s and the 1600s, who are coming to Africa, the Dutch, the Portuguese, as they are coming to Africa, getting into the interior, they are actually seeing these places. So if you check their diaries, they are recording, like Great Zimbabwe, it's like Great Zimbabwe. They are writing about what they are hearing about it and all that kind of stuff. And they're even fascinated to that extent where they are visiting some of these sites. So these cultures that I'm talking about, they have attracted world attention for so many centuries, as far as the 16th century. And that's why Great Zimbabwe is so popular. But it's not about Great Zimbabwe alone. There are many of these. And with this map, I'm just trying to replicate some of these, spread across modern-day Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Botswana. Right. But like I said, as an archaeologist, we are so interested in going out in the field, doing excavations. But sometimes, because of the legacy of looting, because the first generation of Europeans, up to 1900 that are coming to Africa, they are also interested in these sites. And they end up actually digging these sites. And they looted a lot of objects. And that's why today they are sitting all over the world. So this is just images that are showing some of the gold objects that were looted from these sites, especially Great Zimbabwe, like ounces and ounces of gold that were looted from these sites. The idea is Africa is an empty landscape. There is no claim. There is no history. So who was behind all this? Phoenicians. Of course, nowadays it's about aliens. Right. But of course, the main guy behind this, in order to expand the British Empire, is Cecil John Rhodes. So he has this mind of painting the whole of Africa red, and he's sponsoring some of the earliest excavations that were undertaken at Great Zimbabwe. Mapungubu was lucky because by then it was not known. Until the 1930s, it was not known. But for sites like Great Zimbabwe, as far as 1898, they were under attack from looters, like who are going there, digging, collecting for their personal, of course, cabinet of curiosities. And much of the collection ended up in the hands of Rhodes. How? So he financed the Ancient Ruins Mining Company, being, of course, a mining magnate based in Cape Town. He used to be, I think, the prime minister of the Cape Colony. He sponsored some of the antiquarians who ended up digging in Great Zimbabwe, and they brought some of the loot. But they did not bring everything. Some of it, they kept it their own. Like, for instance, we have reports which are showing us that some actually turned some of the gold artifacts into rings for their wives and other things. Then eventually they handed some of the loot to Cecil John Rhodes. They were working with locals, of course, because these guys did not know about these places. So it was just a matter of bribing the locals. They were shown these places, they vandalized them, and they looted. Right. And this is just an estimate of how much of the gold they looted from these sites. Right. And this is one of the places that has been vandalized at Great Zimbabwe on the hill complex. I'm sure you can see that stratigraphically, like, a lot has been damaged, because at some point in time, the stratigraphy was kind of 2 meters, but it was ransacked, and a lot was taken from that. So if you visit Great Zimbabwe today, you'll find structures. The original stratigraphy is on top there. It's as a result of the work that was sponsored by C.J. Rhodes. But eventually, because there was public outcry, especially from the UK, the British scientific advancements of science community, they ended up actually disbanding the Ancient Ruins Mining Company, but they had looted, and much of the collection was now in the hands of Rhodes. So Cecil John Rhodes, being the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, based in Cape Town, he had built his palace, which is called the Groote Schuur, and that's where he stayed. Of course, he had multiple residences in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. And this is now part of the presidential palace in Cape Town. But originally, Rhodes used to stay here, I guess, and also, I think it was between Mozambique and this residence in Cape Town. And in his bedroom, there are still some of the collections that he looted from these sites. And that's what I'm going to share with you. But before I do that, so what Rhodes did, he disbanded the collection from these sites, including Great Zimbabwe, to many museums all over the world. So if you visit the Natural History Museum today, there are collections that are coming from these loots. Some were donated, of course, some were eventually sent back to Zimbabwe. They are now sitting in the Natural History Museum. And of course, we have a lot in the British Museum, as usual. Then, of course, in the Iziko Museum in Cape Town, one of the oldest museums that we have in Africa. Some of the loot actually ended up there, so it's still sitting there today. So it was kind of a gift to the museum for preservation, right? But remember, he kept what he needed at Groote Schuur. So the idea is we have been doing archaeological research. When we are digging at Great Zimbabwe, we no longer find those type of objects that were recovered during this time. So now we are realizing that we were avoiding working with existing collections in the context that they don't have context. It's difficult, to match with them, But we got confidence, especially from museologists, because now we realize that if you really work hard, if you give yourself time, you'll be able actually to attach these objects to the different places that are coming on. Nowadays, there are so many technologies that are helping to do that. So that's one thing that is helping. But my work is grounded in the theory of materiality. I'm a material culturalist. I largely deal with material culture, trying to find out the role of objects in everyday life and the different networks that are created by those objects, because remember the life cycle of objects, they are produced, they are dispersed, they are consumed, then eventually they are discarded, That life cycle is connected to humans. And I'm that archaeologist who love placing humans next to their objects, because our legacy as archaeologists, we tend to be focused on the objects, and we kind of allied the people or the cultures. But I believe if you work with the producers, the consumers of those objects, you create a beautiful story out of that. Decoloniality is also very important because of the legacy of colonialism, because of how Africa is reimagined. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you know that it's rarely possible for people to talk about science when it comes to African prehistory. Science is a concept that is coming from Europe or from the Americas. So you can't talk about it in the context of Africa. But guess what? These guys, they were so ahead. If you would visit Great Zimbabwe, you would see that engineering was part of their culture, and they were doing many things out of that. That's one thing so we are trying to study these objects so as to reconstruct or reimagine the African history through that. But also informed by decolonial thought, the likes of what Thiongo, it starts with the mind, how we view Africa.
Robert, 2 minutes to
Oh my
conclude.
goodness.
Okay.
All right. Theoretical approach. Sorry, let me move on. Okay, so object biographies as provenance research. We are trying to work around with some of the earliest documentation exercises of these collections. So those looters, as they are going to Great Zimbabwe, some of them are writing in their diaries what they are experiencing, and it's useful. The likes of Theodore Bent, Rich Nicklin Ho, and so forth. Then, of course, it goes on to the ethnographic period, especially during the colonial period. The first generation of proper anthropologists who are working in Africa right from 1900 to the 1960s, 80s, they have rich ethnographies that are useful in terms of giving context. Then, of course, the communities are also essential to this. The beauty about it is from the earliest generation of antiquarians, they are also taking photographs of some of these communities, describing them. And, communities that are settling around Great Zimbabwe today, they feature in some of these diaries. So we do have knowledge on whom to consult. And this is actually a picture that is coming from the 1890s. That shows one of the chiefs, Chief Mugabe, who was actually watching as they were looting at Great Zimbabwe. Right. I deal with artifacts, like I was saying, so technology helps me to build these histories which are missing. Then, of course, we rely on communities. This is something, like I said, that is also coming from the discussion that we have been having. Jabulo, we've been discussing about these things, especially the person of Rhodes, and I'm working on his collection in quotes. Right. The idea is we want to document the collections as part of provenance research. We believe that these objects, in as much as they lack context, majority of them, they are helpful in terms of our major goal, which is to reconstruct, reimagine the history of Africa. We want to see how they made. We are very skilled in that. Who made them? There is ethnography for that. Who used them? There is ethnography for that. And how they ended up in the hands of Rhodes and all these other guys whom we was working with. And the process which were followed when he was distributing these collections to the British Museum, to the South African Museum, which is now Iziko, and all other museums. So that's the Groote Schuur Museum. I just want to do a rundown because of time of some of these collections that we are finding. So it's still infants research. At the moment, it's just about documenting the collections and putting them in their proper context. So for instance, I found that bottle, opening it up, that's what you're finding, and pure gold. And we are trying by all means to really document everything. Yeah. It's interesting, these glass beads, they are sitting in Rod's bedroom today in Cape Town. We have done some scientific research, with colleagues in the US, including myself, and this is what we are finding out, that they are actually coming from India through, of course, XRF research and so forth, right? And that's some of the gold. That's some of the gold tags, the gold as well. And these are some of the storage boxes. It's interesting, the early generations of curators, especially, the later generations of curators, they're taking advantage of. We normally do that. I think this is normal for most of our storage rooms, All right. These are the stone, soapstone objects, then slag and other things used for working on iron. Then, of course, we have wooden objects that are also sitting in Rod's homestead. Then, of course, natural collections. And, this is some of the documentation. Of course, we know it's later documentation. Then, of course, spindles. And this bed is very controversial. I'll just comment on this. So when we diverted to address existing collections, the first thing I remember when I reached out to Ezekiel was saying, "You are a Zimbabwean, have you come to claim the Zimbabwe bed for restitution?" I said, no, that's not the whole thing at the moment. We just want to contribute to the basic information in terms of the biography of these objects. Then restitution, if you're interested, the government of South Africa, the government of Zimbabwe, is something that you can work on it later. But at the moment, what you're interested in is giving context to these objects so that it can be easy for the curators when they try to address these other bigger questions, So eventually, they ended up working on them. So last November, I had an opportunity to go and document these collections. So these are the collections at Ezekiel, and these are some of the early tags or cards that were used. And remember, these objects were excavated in the 1890s. Ezekiel has been doing a wonderful job in terms of preserving them. I guess it's just in need of another layer of information in terms of their biographies. And of course, there's misclassification. For instance, I don't know if you can see clearly, this is glass. And as an archaeologist, I know that glass is not coming with the Arabs. Of course, Arabs bring glass, but this type of glass is actually coming later with the Europeans, especially the Dutch and the British. So at the end of the day, there's misclassification around that, but, that's where we're coming. And some of the places where this glass was produced is here, Coimbra. That's where some of the glass is actually coming, especially this one. Right. And these are some of the early interventions in terms of documenting the ceramics. This is one of the letters from the Ancient Ruins Mining Company. It's dated as 1896. That's where some of the collections actually ended up being distributed. So we are also documenting paper collections. Then, of course, one of the earliest maps of Great Zimbabwe. So magnificent, and it's still there. We are trying to intervene in terms of keeping it, because that's one of the original maps of Great Zimbabwe, especially the Great Enclosure. These are some of the bells, the iron gongs. I don't know if you know about them, but they are music instruments. This is the state. So we want to think about how we can preserve them.
We have to finish.
Okay. Then, this is interesting. Fantasy about religion and magic, within the context of the early documenters of these collections, which is kind of wrong. We'll correct that. All right, guys, thank you so much.
I propose a round of questions, 3-4 questions, and then we continue the discussion on a short coffee break.
A short question. The thing is, then I'm going to rephrase. When HEBA and Johanna was talking about the risk of museums to break trust with their communities and lack of solidarity, I was thinking about the Cabinet of Curiosities and thinking what kind of solidarity are museums establishing when they have narratives that are so colonial and establish narratives that are quite racist in a way. And I established this connection because sometimes we are used to think about how colonial narratives somewhat victimizes non-white people, but how they are privileging white people and what kind of solidarity is made there. It's a comment and I would like to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a great panel. Really, thanks to all the presenters. You know, when it's amazing how in many different places, in writing and in presentations, there's a fundamental error in the way hashtag Rhodes Must Fall is understood. It's quite extraordinary how the world has received hashtag Rhodes Must Fall as an anti-colonial movement, as an expression of a revolution. And quite frankly, that is a little too easy, because what you will notice from where Rhodes Must Fall erupted and where it took place, that it only took place in elite institutions. You know, so rather than just being a radical student anti-colonial movement, it was really an expression of black students and their experience in historically white or elite institutions. Where at the University of Cape Town, they were realizing that they were becoming white people and they needed to kind of take control of that. And, you know, it's not a revolution at Oxford University. You know, it didn't take place elsewhere. If Rhodes Must Fall at the University of Cape Town wanted to be a revolutionary movement, and this is what I've always said to them, they would have broken the apartheid walls between universities in South Africa, but they chose not to do that. So I think that we must revise the way we narrate these histories. And I'm very interested in, you know, I bumped into Shadrach when I was in England. In fact, I was running and I had to stop and we greeted and we chatted, because I was very disappointed that he used, you know, in the new project that he has, as he moved from Cape Town to Oxford, the new project that he has on the Bantu. And I find it extremely problematic that scholars use that term outside of language, outside of its meaning, outside of linguistics, and that archaeologists are suddenly using that to describe a people, whereas, quite frankly, it's a colonial category. It is a racist term, and I think really one needs to find other language for this.
I can go ahead. Siraj, thanks for that. Especially the term Bantu. I'm ashamed that I use it, you know. It's those legacy terms that we use in our discipline that needs confrontation. It's just like the term indigenous, you know, because once we say there is indigenous knowledge, it means it doesn't qualify to be called knowledge. There is knowledge, but then there's a category for indigenous knowledge, yet both are knowledges. In fact, every race has indigenous knowledge, you know. So at the end of the day, terms like Bantu it's problematic, and I'm one of those archaeologists that actually struggle with that, thinking about that all the people that we have in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Botswana, they are actually coming from the north. Not realizing that there were people there who would have evolved to become what we have today. So these are some of the things that we are hoping probably to change as we do scholarship. But thank you for that.
Solidarity is a very fragile and slippery concept, and when decolonial work is spoken about, it's sometimes imagined that a introspection with a colonial racist history is doing that work, is somehow in solidarity with something. So I think I didn't 100% understand the question, but historical looking at a racist past is absolutely no form of solidarity.
Yeah,
The thing is, it's how it maintains white privilege, really. I use the word solidarity because it propels me to think that, to have that thought. But the thing is how that kind of exhibitions as the University of Coimbra has, how reinforces white privilege, really. That was what I was trying to address.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. No, I haven't seen the exhibition actually, so I don't want to. No, I wouldn't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen the exhibition either, but it's just I wanted to say something that museums also have this perception that they are so important that they need to have a say on things. So what we wanted to say, maybe we weren't very clear, that no one was it is the museum that expects itself that it has to have a solidarity statement or it has to show solidarity, but in reality it doesn't, because usually its solidarity stands within the geography of where it exists or its audiences and its political position where it's created, let's say, but it doesn't do it with the indigenous communities. So for example, talking about the statements of the political events that happen, many of the museums have collections from Sudan. They've never made a statement about any solidarity with the Sudanese communities, Congo, etc. So it's very selective, but it comes from the politics that exist within it. And I think it's really empty. The statements are empty in a way because they are just fulfilling they do have a political role, but they are selective on which political role they need to achieve or not, I think.
So we close this panel.